and welcome to Undivided. I'm Brandi Kruse. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continuing commitment to give common sense a comeback, and a special thank you to Undivided subscribers who help make this show possible. If you'd like to become a subscriber and support the show, you can do so for as little as $5 a month at patreon.com/undivided. That's patreon.com/undivided, or by becoming a contributor on my locals community, brandikruse.locals.com. Coming up today, the Democrat and Republican behind a new bipartisan push for emergency power reform are going to join us. That's State Senator Mark Mullet and State Senator Linda Wilson. We'll have a conversation about why they feel like it will be a difficult political lift to get it done this year, but why both parties should be on board with trying to put some checks and balances on future governor's powers in the event of an emergency.
You have to look at this of what's the right form of government, not who currently has the governor's seat, but pretend it was the opposite party who had the governor's seat. What set of rules would you want in place?
The legislature is the voice of the people, and we haven't had the opportunity to be their voice in so many things.
Also coming up, we haven't talked about this issue too much on the show, although I've gotten some emails to discuss it further. This issue of these bail funds that are created, sometimes celebrities are behind them, etc., to basically get, I think it kind of started as a way to get quote unquote protesters, who I usually call rioters, out of jail during the summer of 2020 and everything that happened after George Floyd. But now, I mean, they're posting bail for violent criminals. And one such bail fund that has some A-list celebrities behind it has apparently folded. And it might be because of what one of the suspects they got out of jail went on to do. So we'll discuss that. Plus, a migrant drop-off on Christmas Eve is making headlines because, one, it happened on Christmas Eve, two, it happened outside the vice president's house in Washington, D.C., and three, it was freezing cold when these migrants were shipped up on a bus from Texas to D.C. But there was a really interesting interview about it. I've told you guys how I feel about migrant busing. I don't like human beings used as political pawns. I understand why the border towns are doing it, but there was a really unexpected perspective on this whole issue from a woman who works at a nonprofit to help these migrants, who said that actually the busing that's happening might be the best thing for these migrants who end up crossing the border.
It gets them away from places that have very little connectivity into metropolitan areas where taking a bus is much easier, or a train or a plane.
We'll also hear some of your comments on the situation at the southern border in response to a commentary I did on Friday about the fact that, Democrats don't seem to care that you have these deadly drugs like fentanyl being shipped up from Mexico and killing people on our streets in states across the nation. So we'll have a conversation about that. But first, some positive news today on the crime disorder front. Back in February, you'll recall, we did a in-depth story about the situation in downtown Seattle. So there's this, in particular, this street, 3rd Avenue, that had just become a cesspool. I mean, open-air drug dealing, open-air drug use, these bazaars with stolen merchandise, crime, rampant shootings. And one of the issues is 3rd Avenue is a transportation corridor. So you'd get people who'd come down, shoot like a rival gang member, drug dealer, hop on a bus and flee. So it just became an issue. And back in February, the owner of Pierogi, which is a popular Seattle bakery, decided that they needed to close their location there on 3rd Avenue because there had been multiple shootings. And at the time, she released surveillance videos showing just how blatant and terrible the drug use and drug dealing was just outside her business. I want to play for you just a little clip from the story we did with Olga Sagan, the owner of Pierogi, back in February when they closed that location.
What's your message to city leaders?
I have no message for city leaders. I'm done sending city leaders. This is my last message to city leaders. I don't know if they may be not qualified to do their job. Maybe it's a county, maybe it's a state, maybe it's national. I have no message. You can't find who is right, who is wrong. This is too complex. It's a humanitarian crisis, it's a crime crisis. I have no more messages. I will pay my taxes, I will keep employing employees, I'll keep being a good employer here, and I will not be in the middle of the political mess that this city has become fighting over who is right and who is wrong and who is, and forgetting that, we're all people here.
You still have locations in this city. You're still a business owner in this city. So are you going to give up trying to push for change as a business owner?
Yeah.
You're going to give
Absolutely.
up?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And no one is listening. This is not new. This is not, they have, look at how many small businesses we have left here. We only have big businesses here. They're not listening. And at this point, I'm a smart business owner. I have pivoted my business during pandemic. I can read signs, I can read patterns, and this is a pattern that I can't deal with anymore. It's the definition of being crazy, is doing the same thing over and over and over and over and expecting different results.
So at the time when we spoke with Olga, it really wasn't clear whether they were planning to ever reopen that location again. Her big thing was, if it's not safe for my employees and the customers, then we're not going to operate there. A couple weeks ago, Olga had indicated that they were going to reopen today. After seeing that things had gotten a little bit better down there. They were going to reopen today, the day after Christmas. And sure enough, they did reopen that location this morning. I stopped down there late morning to get a proshki and to see how things were shaping up. I was happy to see that at least one Seattle City Council member stopped down there, Councilwoman Sarah Nelson, who is one of the only pro-business members of the Seattle City Council. So I got a chance to chat with her, chat with Olga, and sort of catch up. I will say that business was slow. There were people stopping by here and there, but it is the day after Christmas after all. And I think that Olga is optimistic about, the direction of things downtown. You have Mayor Bruce Harrell in Seattle, who certainly has said the right things, who appears to care about what's happening to businesses down there. But I will still say, actually another subscriber of unDivided met me down there, Matt, and we walked around a little bit just to look at things. And it's still depressing as hell downtown. I mean, it truly is depressing as hell, but it is nowhere near what it was. And I know that the issues have moved around from place to place. Police will come in on 3rd Avenue. They'll kind of clear everyone away. They'll go down a block. But it really is so much better than it was when Proshki originally closed its doors in February. We did see today, some open air drug use. These two guys with stolen vacuums, I think, or like Swiffer sweepers, tried to sell them to us saying, businesses, they were just ranting and raving about how big businesses like Target have just destroyed Seattle, and that this is their way of sticking it to them by selling stolen merchandise. So there is certainly some of that activity still going on down there, and so many businesses still boarded up. So many businesses. It's depressing to see the number of businesses and storefronts that are boarded up in downtown Seattle. So while you have, it appears, the criminal element, where there's been more of an effort to move the criminal element along, and that's a good thing, it hasn't been replaced by, how do I put this? It hasn't been replaced by life and by vigor and by people down there shopping and eating and businesses reopening. So now it's just kind of empty and sad. I mean, it's better than it just being full of drug dealers and drug users and stolen merchandise. But, it reminded me of, so you might recall I had my friend Dave Ross, longtime news radio host in Seattle for Cairo. I had him on Fridays with Friends a few months back. And, we've had disagreements about the approach to crime. He's certainly further to the left than I am. But one of the things he said is, we cannot allow downtown to just be handed over to the ne'er-do-wells. We can't just say, it's too scary to go down there, so we're just not going to do it. I do tend to agree with him that it's really tough because you don't want to tell businesses, open back up down there after everything they've been through. And you don't want to tell people, go down there and shop and dine, when it's really, you can't guarantee them that they're going to be safe. But I do think for people who feel like they're feeling brave enough, and care about the city enough where they're like, I got to go down there and do my part to try to reinvigorate downtown. I think it's a really good thing to try to do. I was going to tell you guys earlier that I was heading down to Proshki, but I'm not the most popular person in Seattle, and so I thought it'd be a really bad idea to advertise when I was going to go down there. But I think that if you're feeling up for it this week, go down there, grab a Proshki, support businesses, stop at a couple of the shops that are open, and slowly, I think, as you replace the criminals and ne'er-do-wells with regular folks who want to have fun and enjoy downtown, I think that we can help government turn things around down there. I really do. But at the same time, the same token, I don't blame businesses and people who aren't quite ready to return to downtown Seattle, because it is kind of in a sad state still. But best of luck to Olga Sagan and to Proshki down there. I told her I'd like to have her on after a few days of them being back up and running, just to kind of give us an assessment of how things have gone. So I do look forward to having her back on the show. The following segment is presented in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. I told you guys one of my top priorities heading into the legislative session is, there are so many, but is to try to get lawmakers to actually take action on emergency power reform. We saw for several years during the pandemic that in Washington state, there are no checks and balances, virtually no checks and balances on the governor in a state in a time of emergency. And I think that's wrong. I think that directly elected representatives in the House and Senate are closer to the people. They represent the interests of constituents across the state as opposed to representing the interests of just the city of Seattle. And I really thought that they should demand to have a say in what was happening with the closure of businesses and the mandates and restrictions that were put down. And it was really disappointing to me that Democrats just didn't want anything to do with it. Well, this session, as I mentioned on a previous show, there is now a bipartisan proposal that has been put forth to try once again to work toward reasonable emergency power reform. It was put forth by Republican State Senator Linda Wilson and has been co-sponsored by Democratic State Senator Mark Mullet. I spoke to both of them about what it would do. I know you guys have both supported in the past putting some checks and balances on a governor in a time of emergency. So how did we get to Senate Bill 5063 and both of your names being on it? Senator Wilson, we'll start with you.
Well, a few years ago, I started running the bill 5039, which was, I think the first time, well, it was 2 years ago. And I think after the emergency started and the governor called the state of emergency, that's when I realized that there was more that we needed to do, that legislature needed to be part of the decisions. And so started looking at the bill from the year before, which was a bipartisan bill. Senator Hunt had signed on to it, and it was tweaking the law because it had been years and years since that law had been looked at. And then we needed to figure out a way to involve the legislature with the others, because it was the shutdowns of the businesses, declaring who's essential, shutting down the schools, things like that. So that's what prompted the bill.
Senator Mullet, emergency power reform is a far less popular position for folks in your party to take. So how do you find yourself on this bill? Why is it something you're willing to sign on to?
I think I've signed on with Senator Wilson the past few sessions because I say to my colleagues, you have to look at this of what's the right form of government, not who currently has the governor's seat, but pretend it was the opposite party who had the governor's seat. What set of rules would you want in place? And I think if everyone's being intellectually honest with themselves, they would all support this bill, because if the shoe was on the other foot, we would want this bill in place. And so I don't see how. My message to my colleagues is we should respect how our Republican folks would want the same, and we would want the same. And this bill is actually the right public policy for the state of Washington. The governor can enact an emergency. It can't go on forever without involving the legislature at a much greater extent.
So let's talk about really one of the two big things that this does in terms of giving the legislature a little bit of oversight. Because when I look at it, it not only seems very reasonable to me, but it still seems like a high bar. You know, it's not making it very easy for one party to come in and to undo what the governor has done. So Senator Wilson, can we start with you? Can you talk about, we'll split this up between the two of you. Can you talk about one of the big changes that this bill would put into place when it comes to emergency oversight?
What it would do is after 90 days from the original call of the emergency power or emergency state of emergency, then we would have the ability to come in and as a legislature and either extend it or terminate it, right? And with our bill, you would have to if we're out of session, all four corners would then have to vote to extend the emergency. If and that we didn't have that. We don't have that at all right now, particularly when it comes to statutory orders.
And just to be clear, the element that allows if the legislature is not in session, a state of emergency has already been in place for more than 90 days, and you say the four corners can come in and they can, in writing, terminate it. That means the minority leader and majority leader in the House and the Senate.
That's
correct.
So there has to be, in order for that to happen, there would have to be unanimous bipartisan agreement amongst the leaders in the House and the Senate.
To extend it, right. It would take four corners to extend the emergency.
Senator Mullet, the other element where if the legislature is in session, they would have to, via concurrent resolution, decide what to do with the state of emergency. Can you explain what a concurrent resolution is?
Well, you basically just would have to have approval from both bodies. This is the course of action they want to take. And so you're forcing people to take a vote on whether or not this is what they want to see happen. It just would guarantee that we're kind of being held accountable to the people we represent. Because each legislative district, if you say that's roughly 160 or 70,000 people, we're much closer to the people we represent than a statewide elected official who is representing 7.6 million Washington residents. And I think the idea is hold people accountable down to the lowest ladder rung you can.
Mm-hmm.
With that concurrent resolution, though, so this is section B, if the legislature is in session through passage of a concurrent resolution terminating the state of emergency, is that a simple majority? Is that more than a simple majority?
I think it's a simple majority, Senator Wilson, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you, Senator Mullet, to weigh in on, I kind of want to pick up where the legislature left off last year. There were some Democrats who had some maybe tight races they were facing in November of 2022 who expressed interest in the 2022 legislative session in emergency power reform. Senator Emily Randall was one of them. She ended up winning her seat again, but she pushed a bill, much to the disappointment of the governor, when it came to emergency power reform. Do you believe that that was a genuine effort to actually make change, or do you believe that was an election year stunt?
Well, there's definitely members in the Senate Democratic Caucus who wanted to see the reform. I thought that bill, I mean, I use the term butter soft. I thought it was not a very hard, aggressive bill. No. And I will admit, I was shocked when that bill passed the Senate and went to the House, the efforts the governor's office went through to make sure that bill didn't pass the House, because it just wasn't that aggressive of a bill. As you read it, it would have been hard, I think, with that bill, because I think we needed 3 out of 4 in that bill, Linda. But once again, that bill, it took an active effort to end the emergency. It wasn't like it took an active effort to keep it going.
Right.
And I think that's Senator Wilson's bill says, you can keep it going, but it's going to take some energy. Whereas the bill the Senate passed last year that the governor's office was obviously very uncomfortable with, because they put a lot of political effort into making sure it didn't get out of the House, was basically it just made it a little bit easier for us to end the emergency, but it still took a lot of political effort on our side to do that. And so it didn't pass the House, but there were folks on my side, I know, I'm not going to out them here right now, but who wanted to see reform as well. And so maybe the prime sponsor of the bill might have been picked for strategic reasons. I think you bring up a valid point there, but there was, I can assure you, a group of Senate Democrats who also wanted to see the same reform that our Republican colleagues were asking for.
I love how you say you don't want to out them, like it would be some terrible thing for them politically for people to find out that they support emergency power reform.
Hey, the governor vetoed one of my bills that passed like 49-0 last session. And so I think when I say that, it just, obviously you're priding yourself to have some very non-controversial bills vetoed by the governor when you come out publicly in some of these situations.
Senator Wilson, do you have a different opinion of that? Do you believe that, given the fact that that it's not an election year like it was this session isn't going to land in an election year like this past one. Do you think that that is going to dampen enthusiasm from some Democrats to pursue this?
I would hope that they would see the light. I mean, as Marcus said, there are others that would appreciate moving forward on this bill. And there may be tweaks in it but that's how they're made. And I hope that there would be the political will to do this year. Like you say, it's not an election year, and you have to look at the long term, right? It was 1969 when the original emergency powers were put in, and nothing had been done until 2019. So it's time to look at this. We have different abilities to do things like, zooming to vote and all that. Now we don't have to, ride horse and buggy to get up to the Olympia. So I think that we need to catch up.
Yeah. In terms of priorities, though, Senator Mullet, every session brings new priorities, and I've been looking at some of the pre-filed bills, et cetera. This session, do you think for Democrats that they're willing to make this a priority? You don't have to out anyone, but have you heard any sort of momentum that this might be a priority?
I think it is going to be a tough political lift, is my guess. And I signed on to the bill because I think it's the right piece of public policy that we should have in place for the state of Washington. But I agree with your assessment that it was more likely to, I think, get to the finish line last session, just given the politics of a tough election year coming up, and people realizing this is where I think the general population of the state of Washington wants to see. So I think this is a bill that I think is popular with the voters overall. But I also think this session will be a very hard political lift to make this a priority that gets to the finish line.
And I'm just curious to have you weigh in. I'm not trying to get you in trouble with your party or anything, but something really pissed me off last year at the end of the session. Like you said, this emergency power reform passed the Senate. It goes to the House. And then all of a sudden at the last minute, it doesn't move. And some Democrats in the House blamed Republicans, saying, well, they wanted to come to the floor and speak about this, and it was wasting time and we didn't have the time. So they just killed it. Do you think it was fair to blame Republicans for killing it at the last minute?
I don't think it's fair. I was obviously in the minority in the Senate my first 5 years there, from my 2012 election through the 2017 cycle. And when we were in the minority, that's the tactic you do in the minority, is you tend to slow down floor debate, because a lot of times the chamber, the group that's in charge of the chamber is passing legislation that you might not like. And so it's a very traditional minority tactic to try to slow down the speed of what bills are going through that you don't like, because the theory is if you spend more time on one bill, that could be 5 other bills you don't like that don't come up for a vote. So I think that's a very traditional practice that both sides of the aisle have used. So I don't think it's very fair to say, oh, what you're doing is now we're going to punish you for it, sort of thing.
Yeah. Senator Wilson, let's end with this, and it'll be the same question for both of you. Even if you want to speak more broadly about the upcoming legislative session, what are your hopes for it?
Well, I at the very least, I hope we get a hearing, right? We didn't even get a hearing for the last 2 years. And so not only did it not get a vote, but it didn't get a hearing. So I would like to have the conversation, right? An honest and open conversation about the plus and minuses of doing this. And that's what we can do in committee. And I'm not in that committee, but certainly I'd like to get in there and express what my concerns are and represent those that elected me, right? Because that's what's been lost in this whole thing, is that the legislature is the voice of the people, and we haven't had the opportunity to be their voice in so many things. I mean, there was like a couple of years ago, or I should say later in the emergency, there was like 500 proclamations, and so many of them we had no voice. So that's what I'm hoping for, at least.
Senator Mullet, similar question for you. And then I guess, how would you message this to your party when you're trying to maybe convince them that, hey, we need to take a serious look at this year?
Well, I think my main message is the one I mentioned earlier, that you have to pretend the shoe is on the other foot. What do you think is the right public policy for the state of Washington? And that would be, it's the same message I've had before. And I think last year the argument was, well, the Randall bill is moving, and so that's the bill they heard, and that's the bill that was going through the legislative process. I'm not aware of any Democrat-sponsored bills this session, so I think Senator Wilson's bill that I've signed on to is the one that can force this conversation to happen, and hopefully it does.
And I gotta say, it just disappoints me to hear, Mark Mullet might be one of the most honest politicians in Olympia, because he just says what he thinks is true, even if it bothers his own political party. But it just bums me out to hear him say that he thinks it'll be a heavy political lift to get emergency power reform, to get his party on board with emergency power reform this session. And it's just silly to me, because any of you, I just challenge you to go and read the bill. It's not even that long. It is so common sense. It would require bipartisan agreement to undo anything that a governor has done when it comes to a state of emergency. And for that reason, it's like I said, it's so reasonable, it's so common sense. And I think it would show a lot of good faith on the part of Democrats if they try to get something done on emergency power reform this session. And I really hope they can make that happen. The previous segment was brought to you in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Have you guys heard of the Bail Project? You've probably heard about things like it. So in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, there were these bail funds that were popping up to bail out people who'd been arrested during protests and riots, which I thought was stupid at the time, because you don't get arrested for peaceful protest. I mean, I'm sure there have been some instances of people who got swept up in something and they shouldn't have been arrested. But by and large, from my experience as what I would consider a professional protest coverer at this point, having been in Seattle for 13 years, you very rarely go to jail for peaceful protests. And so I just thought it was odd that you'd have these celebrities and high-profile folks on the left giving their money to bail people out of jail. But look, at the time, if you're bailing people out who were fighting for racial justice or whatever, like, I can understand a little sliver of that. But then these bail funds really got out of control, and they were posting bail for violent criminals, and it was really a head scratcher. And there's this particular fund called the Bail Project. John Legend is one of the really high profile pushers of this bail fund. And according to the New York Post, the Daily Wire, and some other local news outlets on the West Coast, the Bail Project is now no more. It has ceased operations, and there is a thought that it's because of someone who they bailed out, who went on to try to kill a waiter in Las Vegas. Oh, you don't say. You absolutely don't say that somebody who they posted bail for turned out to be a really dangerous criminal. So the guy who they posted bail for, the bail was posted back in December of 2021, so about a year ago. And the Bail Project posted a $3,000 bond for Rashawn Gaston Anderson, who was suspected of burglary. Burglary is no small crime. I mean, it's insane to me. Like, even if you're John Legend, you have millions and millions of dollars, why are you giving any of it to get a burglar who you don't know out of jail? Is that not the most bizarre thing? Think of all the other ways you could better spend that money. So anyway, they bail this guy out of jail, I guess in the name of racial justice or something. Well, 6 days later, this guy shoots a waiter in Las Vegas 11 times. Thankfully, he survived, but obviously his life will never be the same. He has long-term injuries that he'll live with for the rest of his life. The waiter's name was Cheyang Wang. Again, shot 11 times by this 24-year-old. So anyway, you fast forward, and this 24-year-old is then convicted of the attack on this waiter, sentenced to 7 to 18 years in jail for this shooting. Well, the waiter, and I don't blame him, is now suing multiple people that are involved in this, but also suing the Bail Project, saying, look, here you had this guy who showed that he was dangerous, and you went and put up the money for him to be able to get out, and 6 days later he tried to kill me. And so there's all these lawsuits around this particular shooting, and good for this waiter. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. And so now the bail fund, according to them, they've restructured and it led to them ceasing operations. But I think it just goes to show, and we've talked about this on the show before, like who are you siding with? And this is my question for politicians. We've seen a lot of this in Washington State and for these like woke celebrities. Why are you choosing to side with criminals over law-abiding Americans? Why are you choosing to side with a young man who commits a burglary or a robbery, tries to take something that belongs to someone else, over the person who is victimized? Why aren't you creating a fund to help the victims of burglaries, the victims of robberies, who are oftentimes people who are marginalized? And so I think it shows a really disturbing prioritization of criminals. And I go back to what I said last week on the podcast about some of these laws in Washington State, you know, laws being pushed to increase the pay for prisoners behind bars, laws being pushed that would make it so that prison inmates no longer have to work to offset the cost of their incarceration. And instead, that cost will be borne entirely by the taxpayers of Washington, people who are minding their own business, working hard and not breaking the law. And so, you know, I hope that this case, as sad as I am for what happened to Swader, I'm so glad he's alive, but I hope that this is a wake-up call for these, you know, people on the woke left who want to post bail for criminals and think that there are no potential consequences for that. I really hope people like John Legend can dedicate their time, their influence, their resources to something a little more productive. And hell, if what you want to do is help young men of color who might be in and out of trouble, invest in their education. Invest in work programs, invest in community projects that will make it so that these young men never commit a burglary, never commit a robbery. That is a much better use of your money for those individuals and also for society as a whole. There is another busing controversy afoot with the immigration situation at the southern border. So on Christmas Eve, Texas Governor Greg Abbott sends a busload of migrants and drops them off outside the home of the vice president in Washington, D.C. And, you know, on any other day, I guess this would have been just another busload of migrants, nothing out of the normal. But of course, it's Christmas Eve. And then it's like 15 degrees outside, like one of the coldest Christmas Eves on record in Washington, D.C. And so folks are freaking out about this. And I've made clear how I feel about the busing situation. I think it is using human beings as political pawns. I don't particularly like it. However, I understand that it is not fair to these border communities. Many of those towns are very, very small. They are inundated day in, day out. And I also understand the frustration of governors of border states who are like, you guys are screwing this situation up. You're causing this at the federal level, Democrats in particular, and then we're left holding the bag for all these issues and trying to deal with this. And so they want to put this issue front and center in cities like New York, you know, sanctuary cities like New York, up to Martha's Vineyard in Washington, D.C., outside the White House and the home of the vice president. So I understand the concept. I just wish it weren't necessary. And I wish we hadn't gotten to this point. And as I discussed on the podcast on Friday, it's disgusting to me that we can't see some real progress on this issue, that we can't look at it as, yes, a humanitarian crisis, but also a very serious border security crisis with drugs coming up and killing people on streets in cities across the country. So that's how I feel about it. But I was really particularly interested with the take of a woman who works for a nonprofit. Her name is Tatiana Laborde. She's the managing director at SAMU First Response. So SAMU has been basically, as these migrants are bused places, they'll be there to meet them, to help them, to get them settled and all of that. So she goes on CNN with Sarah Snyder. And it was very obvious. So first, the White House had some really strong words about this particular incident. Basically saying, you know, shame on Texas for sending these migrants here on Christmas Eve. They called it cruel, dangerous, and shameful. A White House spokesperson said, Governor Abbott abandoned children on the side of the road in below freezing temperatures on Christmas Eve without coordinating with any federal or local authorities. So on CNN, again, this woman, Tatiana Laborde, comes on, and I think CNN, I don't think the host was expecting what Tatiana was going to say. So one of the things to know is Tatiana said on CNN, well, actually, we knew they might not have coordinated with local or federal authorities, but we were told by an NGO in Texas that these migrants were on the way, and we were there waiting for them, so they didn't like sleep outside in the cold. But, Sarah Snyder with CNN kind of goes on to try to, I think, get her to confirm what the White House is saying, is that this is cruel, this is an awful thing to do to these migrants. And this woman who works with these migrants actually has kind of a more nuanced opinion about it.
Tatiana, what do you make of the fact that they were dropped off in front of the vice president's home?
Look, at this point, they've been doing that for so many months that we have the system already down, and it's just another spot that has very little impact. We have buses on site ready to just move them quickly and get them to a safe place.
Do you think this is, as the White House has said it, sort of a cruel decision being made with people's lives?
Well, there's two ways to look at it, right? The way they're doing it is extremely inhumane, but it is a service to the migrants. A lot of them don't want to stay in Texas. A large majority keep wanting to go up north. So this gets them closer, and it gets them away from places that have very little connectivity into metropolitan areas where taking a bus is much easier, or a train, or a plane. So if it's done correctly, it could really help ease in the tensions at the border.
So again, I thought that was very interesting, where she's saying, like, look, is this an ideal situation? No. But these migrants don't want to stay in Texas anyway. They want to get to major cities like New York, like Washington, D.C. They have better access to services, better access to transportation. And so ultimately, yeah, the busing might not be a very good look, but it is ultimately probably more helpful to these migrants. But again, so I just thought that was interesting, because I don't think Sarah Snyder with CNN was probably not the soundbite that she was looking for. But it also is just sad to me that this is kind of what we're arguing over. We're arguing over, where these migrants end up being shipped to, as opposed to arguing over how we can stop them from coming across the border in the first place. Like, this is just exactly how government works. You don't want to get to the root cause of the issue. And I think that if Democrats were just as mad about these long, dangerous journeys that these migrants are coming on to get to the southern border because they know that they can get in, if they were just as mad about that, I would hear them out on the busing issue. But because they're mad that all these migrants, this is so inhumane, they're being bussed in these cold temperatures, well, how do you think they got to the southern border? Do you think that was a particularly humane journey? You think it was a little cold at night while they were being smuggled across the border? Going across the Rio Grande, I promise you the Rio Grande, even in Texas, gets pretty cold this time of year. And so it's this selective outrage over different elements of the migrant crisis, whatever's politically palatable, whatever they can score political points by being angry about. And meanwhile, nothing's being fixed. It's just getting worse. Everybody's pushing the problem around, pointing fingers. And it is just really indicative of what the two-party system has done to the United States. And I really do blame the two-party system. I think that if we can't break free at this moment in time from the two-party system, none of these major crises are ever going to get solved, because it's all about winning elections, scoring political points. You're not going to give the other side a win, because that would mean that they can use that win during an election time. And it's really all just sad and freaking depressing, to be honest. I wanted to read a couple of your comments, though. On Friday's podcast, I talked about how there was this massive drug bust that was linked to the Mexican cartel up in Washington state. Like 500,000 fentanyl pills. Each one of them had the capacity to kill a Washingtonian. I didn't see the governor speak out and say, oh my gosh, we need to do something about what's happening at the southern border, because he genuinely does not care. So a couple comments on all of that. Chris says, and this is from Patreon, government borders on incompetent to being outright corrupt. The grant process, employees beholden to politicians, etc., because they don't have any competition. Government is a monopoly with the power to tax and spend, and it's because of that power, taking money from everyone and redistributing it to their friends, cronies, and political supporters, that it festers. Truly, the government that governs least governs the best. I agree. Hugh says the border immigration issue is incredibly easy yet impossible to solve. Put severe restrictions on border crossings. Dems, oh, we couldn't agree to that. Grant a path to citizenship to those who came here illegally but have lived here peacefully. Republicans, oh, we couldn't agree to that. Yeah, there's no compromise. Jay Smith on Locals had a really lengthy response to this. I wish I had time to read it all, but he said, excellent example of one tragedy related to the border invasion. Shocking how media were concerned about kids in cages, now ignore them sleeping on sidewalks as even community shelters have exceeded capacity. The immigration scam needs to be called out. The asylum game is simply fraudulent, intended for victims to escape tyranny. In a neighboring country, the U.S. is flooded by individuals from around the world, including dozens on the terrorist watch list. Paying thousands of dollars for travel and free passage to drug cartels is not some poor immigrant. And I agree with you. I do think, similar to the homelessness industrial complex, which I used to deny existed, and now I just cannot deny. I've been totally red-pilled on that issue. And the border issue is the same. I mean, they refuse to be honest about what's happening. And like I've said over and over on the podcast, it's like, this is why people in the middle need to speak up. They need to find a voice, common sense people, because I think the majority of us realize that it is both a humanitarian crisis and a border security crisis. But for some reason, we keep voting for people of political parties who are all in on one or the other and not both. And it's ridiculous. So I think people need to start speaking up, speaking out against this two-party monopoly that's ruining our country and that is failing to fix some of our most pressing crises. All right, that's it for today's episode of Undivided. As I mentioned earlier, if you feel comfortable with it and up to it, stop by Proshki down on 3rd Avenue in Seattle. You can enter on 4th Avenue. That's probably a better location to enter at. It's between Pike and Pine, so 3rd Avenue is still a little sketch in that area. But stop by, visit Olga Sagan and her crew, and show support for them. I was really happy, again, to see at least one council member down there when I went there today. And I broke my diet and had a pierogi, and it was freaking delicious. All right, I will see subscribers on the Wednesday episode. If you would like to join us on the Wednesday episode, we have a lot of fun on Wednesdays. You can do that by becoming a subscriber for as little as $5 a month at patreon.com/undivided, or by becoming a contributor on my locals community, brandykruse.locals.com. Another thing happening for subscribers this week, we're doing our monthly subscriber live Q&A tomorrow, Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Pacific time. So if you become a subscriber, you can have access to that as well. I will see all of you subscribers on Wednesday, and non-subscribers, I still appreciate you. I appreciate you listening to the show. I'll see all of you on Friday.